All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the Automation Center of Excellence, a powerful lever to expedite your hyperautomation journey webinar event from Ashling Partners. We're really excited to have you join us today as we have a lot of great content and a phenomenal panel for you today. So we wanted to kind of kick things off by introducing our great panel and event speakers. We have Sushma, Brian, David, and James, all from Ashling Partners. And I'm going to turn things over to the panel to give a full introduction. So Sushma.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. I am Sushma Anuparthi, and I'm currently working as advisory for healthcare and insurance at Ashling Partners. And in my current role, I get to work with various businesses and organizations to help establish or scale their automation center of excellence program. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Barrett, and I'm a managing director here at Ashling Partners. What I have focused on is both the implementation of the automation solutions, but also working with organizations as they've put together their COEs, and then also work with their COEs to really expand the scale and impact of their programs. And I've really been looking forward to sharing some of the insight that I've learned over the years in doing so.
Hello, everyone. David Kinney. I come in with about 30 years of experience in IT and consulting, process improvement. I'm a senior leader in our Modern Robotics Operations Center, and I'm specializing in the areas of global scale, analytics, and operations support. Like the rest, I'm very happy to be here to talk today.
Hi there, I'm James Wilson. So similar to Sushma, I'm a director in the advisory role, helping companies establish their COEs and scale. And like many of us, I previously come from an organization where I ran the automation program in the finance and accounting department. So I bring that experience to bear as well. And just like all the others, excited to be here for this discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for doing the introductions. And we'd actually like to kick off with a quick poll. So do you currently have an automation COE? And I'm going to pull the question up on your screen. So just answer yes or no, and give everyone a couple of seconds to make their selection. And then we will share the answers with the group. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and share the response. All right, so it looks like a majority is currently not utilizing the COE.
Okay, thank you for sharing this. I think again, I think this really brings a great opportunity here for the organizations to establish the automation COE, and why. Hopefully by the end of this meeting, we will be able to kind of justify that.
So another poll here, where are you currently in your automation journey? So haven't started, just starting, implemented, looking to change, or well established. So I'm going to pop the questions up again to answer. Everyone a couple of seconds here to put their responses in. We still have a couple more responses coming in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and
so 30% haven't started, 40% just starting, and 30% implemented. don't have much in the looking to change or well established. I think, the results are very interesting, just based on what we are seeing, from different industries. Like just starting 40%, that is very promising, because as we are working with different organizations, we are seeing that either they haven't started or just started and really looking for ways to scale the program. So this is a perfect session to kind of, I try to understand why we need a well-established or a good foundation for the COE, and also like how to scale. What's the reason, or what's the benefit of scaling the COE. So thank you for sharing your current state with us. Very helpful.
These are the topics we're going to cover today, and we're going to transition right away into the strategic role of the automation COE. And I'm going to hand things off to Sushma to get started.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Alex. So before we dive into discussing about the strategic role of automation COE, let's spend a few minutes talking about, the hyperautomation. So that's the buzzword I'm sure, all of us have heard. Automation, hyperautomation, how is that really tied to the automation COE, right? So as we all know, COVID-19 is accelerating automation across multiple industries such as healthcare, insurance, manufacturing, where the digital adoption is really taking place at both the industry as well as the organization level. And organizations are more and more relying on some powerful levers, and hyperautomation is one of them to really drive the efficiencies and reduction in cost. For instance, McKinsey conducted a study on the current state of property and casualty insurance, and the results indicate that efficiency gains and reduction in cost are one of the top 6 forces that will be shaping the industry in the coming years. I think that just underlines the importance of organizations having to, or need, looking for levers to drive those efficiencies and cost reduction initiatives. And that is where, the hyperautomation really comes in, right? So what is hyperautomation? So hyperautomation is really the evolution of the robotics automation platform, orchestrating multiple advanced capabilities like artificial intelligence, process mining, conversational AI, or voice analytics, and leveraging all these to automate the highly manual and complex processes to that helps organization drive those efficiencies and ultimately drive the reduction in cost. So with that, next slide, please, Alex. Even the Gartner forecast says that the hyperautomation market to reach nearly 600 billion this year. I think that just underlines the importance and need for the hyperautomation, right? So as we all understand or agree on, yes, hyperautomation is one of the powerful levers that can help organizations drive the efficiencies and reduce cost. So now, what are some of the levers that can help us and help the organizations expedite that hyperautomation journey? That is where really the automation center of excellence comes into picture. Having a well-established, which has a strong foundation, automation COE can help provide the much needed direction and vision to the automation program. And it provides a framework to scale the automation program. Any program, automation program that does not have a strong center of excellence, a centralized governance program can, really stagnate the program. And it helps in establishing the standards and best practices that can be applied, across the organization. And last but not the least, to drive change management practices across people, process, and technology, which is very critical as we are implementing the automation program and scaling the program. Again, what we are seeing here on this list are only a very handful of benefits, but the automation COE can really create that broad spectrum of the holistic way of driving the automation program for a given organization, and resulting in more ROI overall. And as we establish the automation COE, driving that with a speed and scale needs a structure. And that is where these three components really comes into play. So next slide, please, which is the plan, build, and run. So at a high level, the plan component can be defined as where the strategy and vision being defined, and focusing on identifying the right automation candidates. So one key thing to always keep in mind is it's better not to automate than automating a wrong process, right? So that is where much needed emphasis needs to be given in the plan phase to ensure that we have the proper intake, a proper validation and prioritization being done in identifying the right automation candidates, to ensure that organizations are investing their efforts in the right place at the right time to maximize the ROI. And then comes the build phase, where the identified opportunities in the plan phase are now ready to be implemented. Making sure that we have the development and the coding standards all in place, much more standardized approach is always helpful. And then the run phase is so now that the opportunities are identified in the plan phase, implemented in the build phase, and deployed, once they're deployed to the production, that's where the run phase really comes into picture and plays a very critical role in terms of making sure that the health of the automation that is deployed is good, to ensure that the automations are achieving the intended business outcomes. So structuring it this way will help us to make sure that we are giving the right level of focus needed to an automation use case all across the life cycle. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to James Wilson, who will be talking in depth about the plan component.
Thank you, Sushma. Yep. So just to kind of double click on that plan a little bit, there are some things that you need to do up front. And some of the first things is that you need to understand how you're going to be reporting into the organization and how you're going to be interacting with the different parts of business. So establishing that governance structure is really, really important. Understanding if you're going to a federated model or a centralized model is really something that you need to plan on day one. Now, you can have a vision that there will be a different model once the program has matured, but that generally kind of occurs organically over time. It's important to align the automation program to what's important to the business as well. So we're not here, and Sushma said it as well, we're not here to automate just because it's fun, but we actually need to move the needle. So we need to ensure we know, and the automation program knows, what are the most important objectives, whether it's saving time from people, enhancing revenue opportunities, closing the books more quickly. You have to make sure that you're clear on the goals of the automation up front to help be your guiding stars. And additionally, take the time, sit down, draft your automation charter. There are many things to think about, and even just the act of putting thoughts onto paper will help you solidify how you're organizing and what controls, reports, and roles are really important to you in your automation program.
James, those are some really great points to look into as the organization is trying to establish and the automation COE, and as they're defining their strategy and vision. So what do you think are the biggest challenges you see organizations face when defining strategy and vision?
Sure. Well, there's a couple. I would say it can vary depending on the culture of the organization, but there are times that automation programs don't think broad enough. Maybe it starts in finance, and it kind of gets labeled as a finance project, and it makes it difficult to scale once you change the vision later. not having the right or identifying the right talent within the COE can be a challenge. You need to have people that are active, oftentimes have to be dedicated to an automation program. People with day jobs have a hard time juggling both. An automation program is really something that you should invest in. And then indecisive or a disengaged steering committee. If the executives aren't on board, if they don't believe you're moving the needles, then it's really hard to get the attention from the executive group, and thus the funding and the support that you do need from the top level. So considering those and ensuring that you've thought through those and ensure that you've addressed them is important to avoid those challenges.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on having really the buy-in from the senior leadership and the alignment from them. It's very important to ensure not only the program is really kicking off strong, but also having that sustainable support, to be able to scale the program. So when trying to when tying your automation program goals to the company objectives, how do you know that you're making progress, that you're moving the needle?
Yeah. So, I mean, KPIs, right? So when you're starting to think about the goals that you're tying to, you need to start thinking about the KPIs related to those goals and start benchmarking if you don't have that benchmark available for you already. Make sure you're doing before and afters to really understand, before an automation program came into play and automations went live, make sure that you've got those needles. Now, a common pitfall is thinking that automations will just save time for the business. And that's true. I mean, that is the goal of automation programs, one of the goals of the automation programs. But if you're just giving time back to the business, it can be a little bit of a soft saving. You may lose executive support if they don't see what other metrics are being moved, such as targeting, invoice processing and looking at your DPO, or the cost to process an invoice over a period of time. So that's why it's important to not only have a goal, but also have those metrics that you measure against. And with that, we can transition to the next slide that kind of leads into when you're early on your automation program, you may not, it's very easy to underestimate how much time should be invested in selecting the right things to automate. The pipeline of ideas, the effort of assessing and measuring is a very important pillar of the COE. Remember, automation tools aren't like other software you may have purchased. So when buying an AP solution, it's going to manage vendors, process invoices, make payments, and report out on that. But when you're investing in an automation program, it layers across all processes and technology stack. So this makes it a bit more nebulous to know what to automate. So we recommend employing multiple strategies to gather ideas, to engage and educate your partners in the business when providing those ideas as well. And remember that going out and getting the ideas is not a one and done activity. You don't just do it at the beginning. It's something that you have to continuously invest time and energy into to gather those ideas. The idea submissions will require enough objective supporting data so that you can really evaluate and prioritize them quickly.
Right. James, what are some of the ways you can get ideas?
Yeah, so there's kind of a push and a pull approach, and I recommend kind of employing both. So a push is where people are pushing ideas to your automation program. A pull is where the automation program is going out and pulling the ideas from the business. Both require automation awareness and education. So it does become very important to communicate and educate everyone in the organization that you're going to be working with. It can be as simple as creating a space for people to submit ideas. You could leverage Automation Hub, or it could just be a simple form on SharePoint or an email intake. Also, create and target, ideation or discovery workshops. Create a plan for which departments you're touching when, and kind of build it out as a roadmap. Oftentimes, your steering committee is also going to tell you where to look And even doing a quick headcount analysis to see where there's a lot of headcount deployed by department or by process is also another way to target and look for ideas to automate. Well, either way that the ideas are submitted, like I kind of mentioned, the objective or the ideas must have objective data points that should tie back to the strategic vision and the KPIs that you previously defined. So if you defined closing the books more quickly as one of your goals, then not only should the automation save your time people, but it should save time for people specifically during the closing period. If you're tying this to employee engagement, then make sure that you're doing surveys before and after on the stakeholders to see how much the automation may have impacted them.
Mm-hmm. James, I know you have mentioned a great point earlier where you said that we should not just look at the time saved, but also we should look at other dimensions of value, right? So why not? Why not just time saved, and what is the advantage or benefits of looking at it holistically, and why should we do so?
Sure. I mean, so time saved is absolutely a goal of automation, but tying it to other objectives and measuring the impacts on those will help you avoid kind of that trap of how are we actually helping the business. Time saved and time given back to the business for an executive group might get a little nebulous on like, okay, we gave all these hours back to finance, what are they doing with it? How is it impacting? How is it saving us money? We're not looking to displace people or lay people off. So you have to tie back to other metrics that are impacted. So, examples that I gave earlier, things like, costs to process an invoice or DPO or DSO, if you've got targeted automations in that area of finance. So again, with that, you should make sure to templatize the measurement of those ROIs and business case. Make it easy so that when you're selecting and evaluating those automations and those ideas that have been submitted to you, make it very easy to review, communicate, and get that approval process going. Which once you've kind of templatized that, it makes it easier. But to do that, also make sure that you've defined your funding model. So how are you paying for each of these automations? Are they a capital request? Is each department doing it? Is it through a centralized budget? Also, what about the other costs, the overhead costs, the COE costs, the people that are working in the COE, the licensing of the robots and the path, the ongoing production support once an automation has been deployed. Making sure you know how those things are getting paid for is very important and something that you need to set up upfront in your COE during the plan phase. So make sure this is all clear, and then once you've got a big pipeline of good ideas ready to go, it'll make it a lot easier to request that funding and really scale. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sushma.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Great job, touching on the key aspects that needs to be looked into as we are especially in the planning phase of establishing the COE. So now let's move on to the build phase. So now that we have established the strategy and vision, identify the right candidates, now it's now it's time to implement them effectively, right? So Brian is going to help us better understand and share some best practices. So Brian, what recommendations do you have for organizations seeking to boost their velocity of automation output?
Thank you, Sushma. That's a great question. As James mentioned, as he was talking about the plan, what he spoke about are recommendations on how we can move the needle. What I'd like to focus on here on the build side as well is how we can move that needle for the build and development of the automations. As we look at the hyperautomation industry, the value is really achieved as we're able to increase the speed and scale at which we're able to deploy those automations. And this is purely and probably one of the biggest areas of discussion that I've seen recently is how we can improve or increase the velocity of the deployment of automations. What I have here for you are 3 recommendations on how I've seen organizations be able to boost this velocity. The first one, and this may seem extremely simple and straightforward, but it's enforcing and defining development and testing standards for your program. I think many of you may be thinking, I'm using the RE framework. If you have UiPath, I'm using the UiPath RE framework. That should encompass everything, but that's only the starting point. A few recommendations or things that I would that would also fall here are you using modern folders? Do you have very clearly defined naming conventions? Is there a consistent and standardized way that your developers are handling exceptions within the code? And just one more example of defining these standards in the build is, how are you providing notifications to the business? As if you have this consistency, the experience from the process owner side will be much more consistent across the board. And then also, you're not going to have to go back and make updates to the code as they're requesting additions or adjustments to the processes. On the testing side as well, I'd highly recommend that you enforce that a sufficient number of testing scenarios are performed. If this isn't done, you're going to be in production trying to test and validate the automation, and that's only going to add to the build timeline before it's deployed and fully leveraged in production. And so by having these standards and by requiring a full thorough test is done of the automation, that's only going to increase the process owner's acceptance and understanding of the automation, as well as their support for going live and doing a high volume there quickly. My next recommendation is around minimum viable products. I know at Ashling Partners and many of our clients, what we were doing is we designed the solution, we built it end to end, and then we went through thorough testing. Well, what I've noticed is as we've been using minimum viable products as part of our build deployment, and we really align this with our sprint schedules, what we're able to do is show how the automation is working to the process owners, get their feedback, and make adjustments before we've implemented it entirely. What this has done is reduce some of the big effort of going back and making large adjustments to the build, but rather we can catch that feedback, make the changes, and continue with the build in a much more streamlined fashion by doing so. My third and final recommendation here that I had for boosting your velocity is around the use and communication of reusable components. I think we can all say that it's critical to use, it's very critical to use reusable components, but are you truly using them? And some questions that I have for you is, how are you storing the reusable components? How are you communicating the reusable components? And how are you ensuring that your build team is using those reusable components on a regular basis? Because right at the onset of the program, you're not going to have too many there at your disposal. But as you've done more and more automations for a department or across a certain set of applications, that's really going to boost your velocity, especially in years 2, 3, 4, and plus of your automation program.
Yeah, those are really some great points here on the reusable components, Brian, because especially, I'm sure, this is one of the areas of opportunities for in any organization, and especially more so for the mid to large sized organizations, right, where the pockets of automation, the pockets of development is going on. So having a centralized automation COE program can really provide that framework to be able to store and reuse those components across the organization. Again, all of this really kind of, leads to maximizing the ROI for the investment, right? So Brian, what consideration should organizations make prior to building automation end to end that will lead to greater success and value?
Great. If we could go over to the next slide, I'd love to share some of my thoughts there as well. Overall, what I'd like you to think about are what are the capabilities and outcomes that you're trying to achieve with the builds rather than tool specific. The first thing that I've heard a lot about is the process owner that's the most vocal, or the person that dislikes doing something the most, oftentimes will win in having that build. But what I'd like you to focus on, as James mentioned in the plan phase, is making sure you're identifying those processes that have the greatest value, but then also make sure that as you're building this, you're looking at this as a process that you're able to automate from end to end, and don't look at this as just a single task. There may be pass-offs between each component of the process, but really don't take RPA or automation capabilities to everything. Focus on what you're trying to build and how that fits into the bigger picture of the process so that you can streamline the process end to end through the build. Secondarily, robotics process automation has capabilities that are extremely strong in doing step-by-step what a person does in their day-to-day work. What it isn't very good at is things like OCR, but UiPath has come forward with capabilities and platform components such as document understanding, or UiPath apps or Action Center to really help augment the capabilities of RPA. And as you're trying to automate a process to be able to support those process owners, or you need capabilities such as getting end user input during the process, please make sure you're considering and using those platform components. Because if you're not, you may save on some of the cost, but eventually you're not going to have all the capabilities or the strengths that those additional platform components have. And it's only going to increase your build and increase the dependence that those process owners have on supporting the automation. And so really look at the capabilities that you have, the future platform capabilities that you're going to need, and weave those in as you start automating those processes. The last recommendation here that I have is, I remember in school, sometimes I thought to myself, the difference between an A- or an A, or even a B+ and an A was significant, almost double the work I thought I'd have to do to be able to get that grade. Well, I think that's very similar here with automation. Sometimes doing that end-to-end process requires significant effort to do the last mile of it. I remember for one client, we could automate 90% of the process. They only had about 3 or 4 iterations or executions of a very unique scenario. And we decided to drop that because there just wasn't enough volume, but the effort to automate that was extremely significant. And so as you're looking at the automation and the process that you're automating, consider how much more effort you're going to add for such low volumes or where the value just really isn't inherently there, and drop those areas. What this is going to do is increase that build velocity and also really make sure that it's honed in on the value and what those process owners need to really help them in their day-to-day work.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Excellent recommendations and considerations that you have shared around the build component. Now let's move on to our next component, which is run. So now that we have identified and implemented, now comes the real job, is to make sure that we are effectively measuring and monitoring our digital workforce. So that's where the run component comes in, and David Nee is going to talk us through or provide us some recommendations on how to establish a strong foundation to the run component.
Thanks, Sushma. So we, as you can see here, this slide is entitled Intense Focus on Business Outcomes. You know, it's really common for the automation journey teams to lose focus at some point, and they do that immediately after the deploy. So why would that happen? Well, they're frequently incentivized to move on to the next automation. They've got a backlog, and they're trying to increase the numbers of automations operating in production. So when we talk about a run, you know, by having a function that is addressing this and focusing on the automations in production, we really bring the right amount of attention and the ongoing engagement to the business. And this is allowing growth to occur in that program. So this ensures that the business is really getting the scale they need, right? They're continually evolving, and most importantly, it's demonstrating the health of the automations. You know, when we take this approach, you'll end up with a more complete program and the ability to have more transparency on the value that's being delivered. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we look at this concept of the digital office. This is critical to business, and it's critical across the industry. So how digital employees or automations are managed and measured will be one of the contributors as we evolve this concept of a digital office. So getting to that state is really interesting. It is an evolution, as I've said here and others have said as well. It requires an effective transition from that build phase that we just heard Brian talking about into the later phases, the management phases, and that work being in production. So when we execute that smoothly and in concert, this transition is really laying the groundwork for showing effectiveness of the automations. It's demonstrating the business outcomes, and these outcomes, remember, they were set out at the inception. We have to continue to point back to these time and time again and stay laser focused on them. So this idea, or the focused practice of monitoring the work in these digital employees and supporting them through troubleshooting, fixes, and enhancement is what is going to further ensure the smooth operation. So you talk about a robust monitoring program becoming a bridge from the technology itself to the business. It's helping educate the business on their operations. It's helping them understand the mechanics of how most effectively to manage this digital workforce. Part of monitoring is really going to be about reporting on those key results. I'll talk about that a little bit later here today, and continually showing that real value being delivered. So an example, and this is just an example at the outset, is hours invested back into the business. You heard James talk about more advanced, and I am definitely a proponent of, we've got to get farther beyond this concept of hours invested back, but that is in some cases an initial indicator that's fairly easy to go after. So as the programs begin to understand different perspectives on ROI, this information, interestingly, can serve as an input to further opportunities. So we heard James and others talk about this, right? It's a loop back, a feedback loop for continuous improvement, innovation, and a well-positioned program pipeline. Next slide, please.
So before we go into this, David, can you, great points again, and recommendations around establishing the run. So can you give some examples of how MROC is really helping to advance the digital office at your clients?
Yeah, thanks for injecting the question in there. Sure, it kind of goes without saying that this concept of a digital office is a really, really broad one. There are varied components that will need to be in place for this to really take hold well. So when you look at it through that type of a lens, automation, as you've heard others say here today, it's just a component, right, that helps us get this advantage of the digital office. So what we suggest is that when you have an automation or robotics operations center, right, a team, a center focused on this, it's critical to ensuring that this idea then takes hold and becomes successful. So our clients that have taken this step, many of them have, they're able to more effectively focus their workforce and capacity. So this can mean offloading work of critical team members, right? They have the capability to move to fuller transparency to the business on automation health and value. And you say, well, how is that the case? Because the operations center has that level of rigor in it, that it is monitoring and seeing this detail on a daily basis. They can then serve that back up. Captured the right way, it tells the story. These clients of ours have been able to more clearly articulate where they continue to drive that value. So remember, in turn, this is going to support expanding that program. And really, and this is an area that's kind of near and dear to me, is roadmaps and overall looking at that portfolio in a roadmap sense. It's pointing to the future. So that's probably how I would say that, Sushma.
Great. Thank you, David.
Okay, so we're going to do another quick poll here. I'm going to load that onto everybody's screen. So everyone, we'll have a couple of seconds to answer what areas are your biggest challenges as you're looking to improve upon. Give everyone a couple of seconds here before we end the poll. Looks like we just have a couple more coming in. Appreciate everyone taking the time to answer these. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results.
Okay, there you go. 63% scalability, which is interesting to see. And again, that's the whole really our primary reason for thinking of this webinar, and this topic for this webinar is really to first obviously introduce how automation COE can really help, but also to discuss and share our thoughts on how the COE can really help scale the program. So it's good to see that here. So
great. We're going to move into managing the automation lifecycle.
Yeah, great. So as Sushma pointed out, and I think she was pleasantly surprised, I think I was as well, scale is really when we talk about getting into those last phases. If you are positioning your work correctly and you have a focused team in an operations center to do this, you are able to achieve some of that scale. You're starting to see some of the points of direction to help guide that program. And again, we're always talking about feedback loops going in and being able to support and tell your story. So yeah, the automation lifecycle, when we talk about this, there's a couple of points that really stand out, and this is specifically around understanding your operating model and your approach really to getting there. So this is going to involve putting some rigor around this in terms of the process and getting to best practices. So on the graphic here, you're seeing what is laid out in a chronology, right? And the first three activities are generally following that flow. The last three, I say, go back more into this concept of the feedback loop. We'll talk more about those in a minute. Let's start with the transition. So at that point in this journey, we're going to build strong links here. We're going to build strong links between our dev and our support teams, and this is going to minimize our unplanned issues. It's really the handshake, and it needs to be a solid one. As we move on past that, we're starting to get into the monitoring phase. So we use both people and tools here. It's important to have both of them to assist us in the monitoring. So this is going to involve things like push notifications that are coming out. It's going to involve regional teams and global coverage, talking about scale here. And it's going to create visible and well-positioned scheduling of those automated runs. So after that, we're really getting into this idea of triaging. We're assessing, we're fixing. This is setting a pattern for how best to capture errors. We're going to communicate more effectively with the business through this, and we're going to look at the complexity. Having both the dev and the monitoring resources connected here is really going to be vital to making that phase and that activity a success. And then we get into the backside of this, and this is where I was talking about some feedback loop opportunities. When we talk about enhancing, we're finding that categorizing these in terms of complexity and effort is really helping create some consistency on the delivery. So a couple ways you could look at this. You've got small ones. We typically recommend handling those within the normal support channel, right? Those individuals can take those on fairly quickly and knock them out. For the larger ones, these may become builds where we find that there's a larger team involved. Again, that feedback loop into a larger opportunity. There's really also an in-between on this. We refer to that as a day 2 build, so it's not large enough for a full-blown team, but a little more than the normal support channel could handle. And it really doesn't matter what the size of this is. They all go back and are ideas coming back into that innovation funnel, and they're working towards pipeline generation. The last piece on here, or pieces, are around reporting on metrics and continuous improvement. I kind of look at those as almost one and the same. This is another area for feedback. Here we mean really getting to the next level of understanding in the program. So it's great. You've taken it all the way through this journey. You've established this thing. You've got some rigor around it. You've even engaged a way to get some scale out of it. But you really have to understand and measure and report back on this to truly tell that story of effectiveness and health in the organization and get to your outcomes. So let's take a couple minutes to dig into that idea a little bit further. So why is this important? We've called out 3 areas here. I'm sure there are a number of ways you could slice this up, but purpose, function, and the right level of content. So when we're thinking purpose, we're wanting to point the program in the right direction. We're going to continue to drive inroads with the business. When we talk about the idea of function, this is supporting that business decision-making process. Has to be flexible, right? And it has to encompass an agreed upon set of the right fitting metrics. And finally, content. If the analytics fail to tell the story, so will you. So I'll stop there. I'm going to repeat that. If the analytics fail to tell the story, so will you. I noticed that wasn't the highest piece in the poll that was just taken, but as you scale, especially as you scale and things become more complicated, the program becomes even larger, your story that you're telling out of analytics is going to become critical to maintaining a robust program. So focusing should really be around that long-term ROI. Again, we talked about that initial notion or the simple short-term cost out. You know, that's the quick and easy one. But driving that long-term ROI, it's harder to articulate up front. It will become apparent over time, and it really needs to be brought to light. So you can do this by measuring the quality, the quantity of which the transactions are falling out, and getting to the why. This is meaning, is our business process flawed for some reason? Maybe there are things happening in our process that we're unaware of. You know, these are some good starting questions to begin to test these theories and ask. Again, it's all about knowing our purpose, delivering on the function, and capturing the right and appropriate level of content. So we're starting now to settle into a little bit of a flow and a story arc here. By starting in aggregate at some of the highest levels, the sponsors are going to see what's happening directionally. And we find that if we're arcing the story in this way, this is really the most effective way to engage the business. Drilling down beyond that aggregate level, we start to look at throughput of transactions. Another layer down, we start to get into the conditions that are affecting the process and the flow. And some of those conditions could be affecting other processes and flows as a result. So finally, we're looking at the environment that all of this is running in. So we've got the flows happening, but are we creating our own bottlenecks? Are we sized to grow? Again, these are some questions that we would look to answer as we're building out and supporting this program. So I'd like to show you a little bit now, a demonstration here so you can see the concept in action with insights. So this is our approach to an initial view of automation analytics. It's an initial approach in capturing that story and the story elements that our customers have found to be the most meaningful. So at this point, Alex, can you go ahead and kick off the demo for us?
Absolutely.
One of the questions we often hear about is understanding the investment in the automation program. There are many audiences and angles that come into play here. The executive will want to understand the health and potential of the overall program. The department head may want to see efficiencies within their area. The change manager will want to understand process, technology, and how we impact the people. While the technologist may want to know where and how to make corrective actions. All of these people are interested and invested, and all of them need guidance to achieve their desired outcome. If we begin at the highest level, we see a level in aggregate. We start with some basic indicators, such as a bucket of hours saved, and an equivalent of those hours represented as dollars. In order to view this, it will require a couple of prerequisite things to happen. An accurate assessment of the manual process must occur. We must also understand and correctly attribute the amount of money tied to that amount of time. We do this through capturing and using process baselines. Keep in mind that what we see here needs to be periodically updated as processes, the time to complete, and the cost information may change as the business evolves. Next, we look at data run through the automation. We do this at the transaction level. We see it as successful transactions passing through the system and where those transactions may fall out. As mentioned, we look at successes, fails. We also look at abandoned processes. We understand these as two major types of exceptions. There are business exceptions and technology exceptions, or application exceptions. Further, we can see this on a daily or monthly basis. This helps us understand any impacts on timing that may correspond or conflict with business cycles. Now it's helpful for us to shine a light on those exception types. Remember, we have two, the business and the technology or application exceptions. What do these tell us? They tell us what and where the opportunities are to improve the business. And on the technology side, we see opportunities in what or where to look at the environment. That is to say, where we see risk or where it is right-sized and set up for success and scale. As we look at the exception detail, we are talking about information such as the exception type, the reason for the exception, and its total number of occurrences. We can also look at individual occurrences, that is to say information at the log level, including a finer level of explanation detail, any custom logging, and the specific date and time stamp. This collection of data points can be used to identify trends, course correct, and help build prescriptive actions for our automation community within the business. Our next level of focus is on utilization. This will show us what's running in production, and in other words, the size and the ability to process transactions. You might also call this the piping, or how efficiently things are flowing through the system. At its low points, we see underutilization and the possible opportunities to build out future automations. While at the highs and peaks, we see what may result in a backlog of processing and processing throughput. Again, we look at day and time as important factors here to help us understand load balancing or any other micro or macro factors that influence our processes and may be impacting our overall success. In conclusion, we see that starting with the big picture view of the program is important when we want to understand aggregate factors such as time freed up for the ability to realign that towards more strategic purpose. We see translating that into financial improvement. By looking deeper into these large directional indicators, we begin to understand our work processes and where we achieve our desired outcomes. We also see where tools are right-sized and the technology is positioned for our current success and our future scale. And with any good tool, an ease of understanding how effectively we use it and how we can orient our work efforts to know when and where to make improvements.
So a brief demo there, really appreciate that. We'll turn it back over to you, Sushma, and you can bring us home in today's discussion.
Great. That's a very informational video on how what the UiPath Insights can offer in terms of monitoring and proactively being able to analyze the data. So great information. Thank you, David. So now we wanted to touch on how Ashling Partners can help you. So next slide, please. The Ashling Partners have a very well-defined model in terms of establishing the COE, the Automation Center of Excellence. So which is based on 8 pillars, as we can see here, right? The first one is the strategy and vision. And this is the pillar where we will be focusing on really understanding the business priorities, being able to define the strategy and vision, being able to define like the automation program goals and KPIs, and ensure that we are able to tie those back to the business priorities. And then the operating model. So based on the current structure of the organization, based on where the organization is with the automation, the maturity level, what works best? Is it a centralized automation COE or a hybrid model or a federated COE? What works better? So we will be looking into that and help work with our partners to define that model. And resourcing and talent. So once the automation COE operating model is defined, then we have to kind of define the team structure. What's the right level of resourcing, and what is the talent and skill required, right? So with automation comes a different skill set in order to make sure that we are getting the right output. So we'll be working on defining the team structure and what's the talent and what's the upskilling required to be able to set up success for the future. And change management. Again, I know this is one of the pillars that's often not so emphasized, but in the world of automation, we think that we really need to emphasize on this to ensure that we are driving the change management across people, process, and technology. And process identification and measurement. So, this is one of our heaviest pillars, I would say, because this is where a lot of the identification of the automation candidates happen. Where, as James mentioned about the push and pull strategy, so we do conduct the discovery sessions with the functional business areas. And we also leverage tools like process mining to be able to identify the efficiency opportunities that just not look at the straight automation opportunities, but also look for areas where there may be some process improvements needed or where system enhancements needed. So we employ multiple levers in order to build a robust automation pipeline / roadmap. And then the process development and management. So this is really tied to more of the build component that Brian discussed, is where ensuring that we have the standardized best practices and coding standards are all laid out. And architecture and maintenance. So this is where we will be looking into the infrastructure and security. Do we have the right level? What's the current state? And what are the key recommendations there? And then the maintenance is really, we're talking about the run that David touched on previously. So the maintenance, how are we making sure that we have the right framework in place so that we are proactive in terms of taking care of our digital workforce? We are proactive in terms of getting the metrics, so rather than being reactive. And last but not the least, innovation. Again, as we all know how fast the pace at which this industry is moving, right? So there is always something coming into the market or evolving at a very fast pace. So it's very important to ensure that we have a dedicated arm that's continuously looking for those innovation opportunities. Innovation could be done in multiple ways. It could be, hey, what, we have implemented 30 to 40 automations using RPA for the past couple of years. Now, how can we scale that? How can we bring in those advanced capabilities like artificial intelligence and machine learning, or conversational AI, or process mining, for example, to be able to identify the right opportunities? Because all these can really help scale the program, but also, again, make sure that we are maximizing the ROI for our investment. And also innovation can be thought of as how can we better structure the program to ensure that we are promoting the reusability across the organization. So this is a very, this is one of the key pillars. And so these are the 8 pillars that we will be working on and helping our the clients establish as well as scale based on the current state of the organization. And these are our COE offerings. So we have a COE foundation, which is really kind of establishing, helping or working with our partners to establish. So this is what we call as our day one client, where they do not currently have an automation COE established. So we work with them to establish those 8 pillars that we, that I went through in the previous slide. Typically, the timeline is around 2 to 3 months here. And then we have what we call as COE as a service. And this is more geared towards our day 2 clients and the partners where they currently have an automation COE established, but they are looking for ways to scale. So this is where we will be doing a health check on to better understand the current state, and then again make sure that we are going through each of those pillars to ensure a strong foundation is laid out. And the timeline for this is 12 months to ensure a strong foundation, ideation, and an ongoing governance. So these are our current COE offerings from Ashling Partners. Any questions?
Okay, well, again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We will send everybody a copy of the webinar, and we really appreciate you taking the time.